Okay? Okay. So thank you, Linda and Risa, for inviting me again. I really can't understate or overstate how honored and privileged I feel that you would entrust me to do this. And when I saw the list and I saw what the study was, I immediately was like, faithfulness. Like, that for me is just really something I'm experiencing right now. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. But first I have a question. So I would like to know who here was raised in Kansas? Ooh, a lot, just like the Midwest in general. So those of you who didn't raise your hand, from the South or the East Coast?
West Coast.
West Coast?
West Coast, West Coast.
I guess we can take that up later. So a lot of you are from Kansas or the Midwest. So in the Midwest, in my experience, which I've lived here my entire life, save 1 year I lived on the East Coast in Connecticut. If a family or friends are going through something that's difficult, maybe an illness or a loss, we like to bring casseroles. And I don't know if tater tot casserole's ever been in your repertoire, but tater tot casserole is a very Midwest thing to bring. So, you know, if you've ever been the giver or the receiver of that, it feels good because it's very biblical. God calls us to community to support one another, and we like to feed people, and especially if we don't know what else to do, people still need to eat. So that feels good. It feels good to get it. You feel supported, maybe navigating through a difficult situation. And so that's awesome, and that can feel really, really like God is working through other people to support you. But today I want to focus on those times when nobody's bringing you a tater tot casserole. Because maybe you're going through something that's too painful to talk about. You can't share it with other people for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it's happening to somebody that's close to you and it's not really your business to tell, but it still just really, really impacts you. And so I feel like when those things are happening and it's just you and God, and it's 3 a.m. of another sleepless night and you're on your knees, that is when God's faithfulness shows up unmistakably. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So there are many, many verses about God's faithfulness. I did a quick Google search. It said 36 times God's faithfulness is mentioned in Scripture, and it's all throughout the Bible. 20 times in the Old Testament, 16 in the New, and the first reference is in Deuteronomy. It goes all the way through Revelation. So this is something we can really hold on to. And so Deuteronomy 7:9, which I think is also on your bookmark today, says, "Know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God, the faithful God, which keeps covenants and mercy with them that love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations." And then Deuteronomy 32:4 says, "He is the rock, his works are perfect, all his ways are just, a faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he." And I just thought, what a beautiful beginning in the Old Testament to have those statements about who our God is. And I think the picture of God's faithfulness is just illustrated so beautifully in the story of Hannah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So that's in 1 Samuel, and it's 1 Samuel, 1st chapter, verses 1 through 20. I don't have time to read it all verbatim. I'm gonna summarize, but if you want to sort of follow along, that's where I'm going to be. So 1 Samuel chapter 1, first verse introduces Elkanah. The second verse introduces Elkanah's wives. So the first verse kind of gives a little bit of ancestry about who Elkanah is. Then it moves to his wives. So Hannah is his wife, and then he has another wife, Peninnah. And Peninnah has children, and Hannah doesn't. And so that's obviously a very, very important thing. It's like right off the bat, second verse, we're saying, here's who the wives are, here's who has children, here's who doesn't have children. And so the other piece, I just want to kind of set up the context in these verses. Every year, Elkanah took his family from their hometown to the town of Shiloh to worship the Lord and to give a sacrifice. And I looked that up, it was about 15 miles, so I don't know how long that might take if you're taking your entire family, which it seemed like it was an all-family event, so both wives and all of Penina's children, they made this journey every year to worship and sacrifice. And so when it was time for Elkanah to do his sacrifice, he provided meat to Penina and all of her sons and daughters. So it doesn't say exactly how many children she has, but the way it's articulated, saying all her sons and daughters, sort of leads me to believe there were a lot of children. And then to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her and God had closed her womb. And I thought, he's giving her tater tot casserole because he doesn't know what else to do. And so he's like, she's just a woman. She doesn't need a double portion, but he's just trying to show, I care about you, I love you, and this is how I'm trying to support you. I don't know what else to do. So the scripture doesn't say how she received that or what her response was, but it seems like it was given, out of love and generosity. So obviously Elkanah knows that Hannah can't have children and that this is a source of sorrow and anguish for her. And so then the other person in this story, Penina, obviously knows that the other wife is not having children. And so I thought, well, that would be like a perfect opportunity for her to support the other wife. And she has children and obviously experiences that joy, and so could understand what it might feel like not to be able to have that. But it's the total opposite. It specifically says that she provokes her in order to irritate her. And that this went on year after year. So they're in Shiloh, they're doing this annual event, and every year Penina is basically just poking Hannah over I assume the worst thing that's happening in her life, and it's year after year. To the point where Hannah leaves, begins weeping, and can't eat the feast that they're enjoying. And then her husband Elkanah says to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Really? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Scripture also doesn't record Hannah's response here. Going to leave that there. So obviously Hannah is not having human support in this horrible situation that she's in. It's making life unbearable for her. And so even if our situation is one that we don't share with other people for whatever reason, and even if we're feeling isolated over that, we have this faithful God. When God, I think he does it on purpose, when he just makes space just for him, so that we're not distracted maybe by humans. Again, that's awesome and that's biblical and all of that, but sometimes I think God just wants it to be the two of you, and that's when it can really show up, when going to God isn't just the best approach, it's the only approach, when you feel like that's it. So back to Hannah. So once they had finished, everyone else had finished eating and drinking, she went up to the house of the Lord, and she is in deep anguish, and she is pouring her heart out to the Lord, and she is just praying, and she says, Lord Almighty, if you will look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever be used on his head. And as she's praying, she's praying in her heart, her mouth is moving, she's so animated that Eli the priest thinks she's intoxicated. And so he has to say to her, what are you doing here? Why are you drunk? And she explains to him, like, no, like, I am just pouring out my soul to the Lord. I haven't been drinking wine, I haven't been drinking beer, which, by the way, I did not even know there was beer back then. that was interesting. Anyway, total side note. So she explains herself to him, and Eli says, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked him. And then the next scripture says that she got up, she was no longer downcast, and she went and ate. And that just really stood out to me because I thought, she doesn't know how her story's gonna end. I mean, you know, if you know the story of Hannah, you know she has a child and God does give her that child, but she didn't know that then. But she received God's peace in that time. So she had poured out her soul, she had given her situation to him, and then she received his peace. And that is the kind of heart change that can only come from the Lord. And even though it had lasted for years and years and years, God still remembered her and still stayed with her and was faithful to her. And Lamentations 3:22 through 23, which I think is also on the sheet, says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. Never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. That is just so encouraging. And if you've gone through something that just seems to keep going and you just feel like, God, when is this gonna move? Like the song, I love that song. I thought by now that wall would fall. Like what, God, what, why? He is there, he is always faithful. And you know, Hannah's situation, she did conceive a child, although she negotiated with him, like, God, give me this son, and then I'll give him to you, in which she did. And I don't know about that, but I'm sure we've all done that, right? Like, just God, this thing, it's biblical. Like, why not just do this thing because it's good? If you just, I'll do these things over here. Anyway, I think we've probably all out of desperation. So she fulfills her promise. She gives Samuel back to serve the Lord. And really, you know, however our prayers are answered or not answered really isn't the point. The point is that we are praying to a God who is faithful, a God who is sovereign, a God who is perfect, a God who doesn't waver, a God whose timing is perfect. So there is nothing this world has to offer that compares to the faithfulness of God and the promises that God gives us. I mean, no self-help book can compare to the God-sourced wisdom that God-given promises are given to us in Scripture. And so I'm going to read a few more scriptures here. So Psalm 33:4 says, "For the word of the Lord is right and true. He is faithful in all he does." So every single action God takes is sure and steady and right and perfect. Psalm 36:5 says, "Your love, Lord, reaches to the heaven, your faithfulness to the sky." So his faithfulness is immeasurable. Like, we can't even comprehend the level of faithfulness that he has for those who love him. And then Psalm 40:11, "Do not withhold your mercy from me, Lord. May your love and faithfulness always protect me." God's faithfulness is actively guarding the lives of those who love him. He is actively shielding us and protecting us. And so in the midst of those very difficult, excruciating situations where nobody's ringing the door with a tater tot casserole and it's just you and God, the Bible tells us that he is always faithful, that he never wavers, that he is dedicated to us, and that we should not be busy trying to fix our own problems, for we might miss the blessing of faithfulness that he has for us. And I'm a doer, I'm a list maker, and I suppose and suspect many of you in this room are the same. And so it can be really challenging when you want to do things and you want to get things taken care of. But again, we risk missing that blessing of God's faithfulness if we're trying to create our own universe instead of letting the God of the universe bless us and give us his strength and his peace. And I prayed over this talk today, and I pray that If you're struggling with being faithful because God is not moved and you are not understanding that, I pray that this reminder of God's faithfulness is encouraging to you.